Tonight on All In.
What happens when he gets out and accuses me of things that are completely untrue is that all of a sudden that kindles the crazies out there, and I have threats upon my life.
Dr. Anthony Fauci unmasks Rand Paul.
Why would Senator want to do this? So go to Rand Paul website and you see Fire Dr. Fauci with a little box that says contribute here.
Tonight, my exclusive interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Then,
do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? This is the moment to decide.
Senator Cory Booker on the president's rousing call to protect democracy, and Academy Award-winning filmmaker Adam McKay on the uncomfortable truth in his new hit, Don't Look Up.
You know how many the world is ending meetings we've had over the last 2 years?
Drought, famine, hole in the ozone is so boring.
But All In starts right now. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. During this pandemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci has become a strange point of fixation, even obsession on the right. And it's among those who see him as a kind of stand-in, a punching bag for the pointy-headed public health officials who want to tell you how to live your life. They've even gone so far as to compare him to a dictator and a murderer.
After 2 years of nonstop media adulation, Tony Fauci has morphed into an even shorter version of Benito Mussolini.
This is what people say to me, that he doesn't represent science to them. He represents Joseph Mengele, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor who did experiments on Jews during the Second World War and in the concentration camps.
Fauci's NIH used hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to help fund deadly and inhumane experiments on puppies in Tunisia.
What we learned recently is Dr. Fauci is sending puppies to slaughter, basically.
Well, today, Dr. Fauci was on Capitol Hill testifying on the federal government's response to the Omicron variant, as we see a massive spike in cases around the country, and I think, fair to say, a profound sense of frustration and exhaustion with the ongoing pandemic. Now, Dr. Fauci has testified in front of Congress many times, and by now, we all expect him to face hostile questions from Republicans. But there's one Republican who seems to have a particular obsession with Dr. Fauci, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. It's a bit weird and obsessive, but every time Fauci comes to testify, Senator Paul tries to knock him down over and over again.
I think Dr. Fauci routinely ignores the science and causes hysteria and creates fear. And this is the opposite of what you really want as far as someone leading your public health effort.
Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect.
Dr. Fauci, I don't expect you today to admit that you approved of NIH funding for gain-of-function research in Wuhan, but your repeated denials have worn thin, and a majority of Americans, frankly, don't believe you. You won't admit that it's dangerous, and for that lack of judgment, I think it's time that you resign.
Today, in the hearing before the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Rand Paul's attacks took a new turn as he accused Dr. Fauci of trying to silence other scientists.
Do you really think it's appropriate to use your $420,000 salary to attack scientists that disagree with you?
The email you're referring to was an email of Dr. Collins to me. If you look at the email
that you responded to and hurried up and said, I can do it. We got something in Wired magazine.
No. I think in usual fashion, Senator, you are distorting everything about me.
Did you ever object to Dr. Collins' characterization of them as friends? Did you write back to Dr. Collins and say, no, they're not friends, they're esteemed scientists, and it would be beneath me
I did not
do that? You responded to him that you would do it, and you immediately got an article in Wired, and you sent it back to him and said, hey, look, I've got him. I nailed him in Wired of all scientific publications.
That's not what went on. There you go again. You just do the same thing every hearing.
That was your
Okay, before we get into what happened after that, and again, Senator Paul comes up with all sorts of things he wants to go after Fauci on. A lot happened in today. We're going to play you that. But just take a step back for a second, all right? Let's understand, Dr. Anthony Fauci has been on the receiving end of many attacks. He's been around the block a few times. I mean, for nearly 40 years, he's been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In fact, that salary that Rand Paul mentioned is because he has so much seniority he's accrued in the federal government pay scale. Okay? 40 years. He was appointed to that role in 1984 in the early years of the AIDS epidemic. He was also then the target of some very angry public criticism at the time, because Dr. Fauci had become the public face of the federal government's response to that crisis, to that deadly virus. In October of 1988, AIDS activists protested at the Food and Drug Administration headquarters and outside of Dr. Fauci's office at the National Institutes of Health. The protesters chanted, "F you, Fauci." That same year, Larry Kramer, one of the founders of two major activist groups, including ACT UP, a legend himself, published this open letter to Dr. Fauci in the Village Voice, in which he called Fauci a, quote, incompetent idiot and, quote, a murderer. Kramer told the New Yorker, quote, as far as I was concerned, he was the central focus of evil in the world. Kramer attacked Fauci relentlessly in the media. He called him a pill-pushing tool of the medical establishment, insulted his wife, even compared him to Adolf Eichmann. Now, here's the thing. Kramer and Fauci would eventually go on to become close friends, with Fauci telling the New York Times after Kramer's death in 2020 that they, quote, they loved each other. But nothing changed overnight. In May of 1990, hundreds of activists from ACT UP descended on the National Institutes of Health again. They launched rainbow-colored smoke, wore skeleton masks, and carried signs saying red tape kills us. They even put a fake Dr. Fauci head on a spike. There. So all of this to say, Anthony Fauci is no stranger to public criticism. He's a big boy. Okay? It's something that comes with the territory, something he has had to live with as a public official that all public officials have to. That's what life in a democracy is. 2 years ago, Dr. Fauci and his family started receiving security protection, an armed security detail, as a result of increasing online attacks. And those attacks have only gotten worse with the pandemic and the right's obsession. But today on Capitol Hill, it took a different turn. Dr. Fauci shared a specific and terrifying story about one of those very real threats, after Senator Rand Paul relentlessly attacked him.
What happens when he gets out and accuses me of things that are completely untrue is that all of a sudden that kindles the crazies out there, and I have threats upon my life, harassment of my family and my children with obscene phone calls because people are lying about me. Now, I guess you could say, well, that's the way it goes. I can take the hit. Well, it makes a difference because, as some of you may know, just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, on December 21st, a person was arrested who was on their way from Sacramento to Washington, D.C. at a speed stop in Iowa. And the police asked him where he was going, and he was going to Washington, D.C., to kill Dr. Fauci. And they found in his car an AR-15 and multiple magazines of ammunition because he thinks that maybe I'm killing people.
So as I mentioned before, this has been an ongoing pattern. And it's not just Dr. Fauci, right? I mean, there's lots of people that once they get into the scopes of the right-wing machine, they have a security problem. Dr. Fauci, as you see, chief among them. Every time that Fauci comes before the Senate Health Committee, Rand Paul goes after him. And it's often about a different thing each time. It does prompt the question, why is Senator Paul doing this over and over in such a sort of hostile and performative manner? Well, Dr. Fauci has figured it out. At least he has a theory, and he shared his answer with the committee today.
So I ask myself, why would Senator want to do this? So go to Rand Paul website, and you see Fire Dr. Fauci with a little box that says, contribute here. You can do $5, $10, $20, $100. So you are making a catastrophic epidemic for your political gain.
Now, you might think that might instill some shame into Rand Paul, but no. Just hours after the hearing concluded, Paul sent this email, literally fundraising off of Dr. Fauci, calling him out at today's hearing. Joining me now, the man who's been the receiving end of these attacks, He's been undeterred. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and chief medical advisor to President Biden. Dr. Fauci, let's take a step back and talk about your career in public life and your career at the locus of these difficult policy issues having to do with deadly, high-stakes pandemics and epidemics and diseases. I was sort of amazed as we were going through the footage today to see your head on a spike outside a protest of NIH. I didn't know that it had sort of gotten to that point. Is this sort of how it goes, or is there something different now in the nature of our politics and the nature of the attacks on you that are different than what you've experienced before in public life?
It's entirely different, Chris. I mean, back in the activist days, the federal government was not early on including activists, particularly gay activists, those who were at risk for or who had already been living with HIV, in the kinds of discussions for clinical trials and the rigidity of the regulatory process. They made a really good point. They were fundamentally good people who were not lying. They were reacting. They were trying to gain attention. They were very theatrical about it. If you look at that film, most of those people, many of them now, are my closest friends. They are fundamentally people of high integrity who don't lie, who are trying to get the federal government to do things that, quite frankly, the federal government was slow in doing. And as the face of the federal government, the way they got attention, which was actually a pretty good activist ploy, it succeeded, was to be very iconoclastic, to be very provocative, and to be very theatrical. And that's what you saw in that clip. And they got my attention, and I sat down and listened to them because what they said made absolute sense, and we made major changes. They were dignified people. And like I said, many of them are my closest friends right now. What we're having now is outright lies that clearly are in the realm of politics. I mean, that thing I showed at the hearing is very, very true. We were having a hearing today, Chris, that was a tough hearing. There were tough questions that were asked on both sides of the aisle. I mean, the Democrats clearly, there was not a piece of cake. They were asking very good questions about what the administration was doing. And the Republicans themselves, led by Senator Burr, were asking questions that were important. And Mitt Romney and Collins and Tuberville and others, including Senator Moran, were there asking tough questions. But what Senator Paul was doing was not even giving anyone a chance to make any explanation, nothing productive or constructive. It was totally ad hominem, literally from the get-go, before you could get a word out of your mouth. That's entirely different than the AIDS activists from the 1980s. It's fundamentally different.
I want you shared the story, and I had read reports about the individual who was arrested with weapons, saying that they're on their way towards you. Senator Paul, I think, gave an interview. He said, "Well, that's ridiculous. It has nothing to do with me. You can't hold people accountable for what some violent, disordered person is doing. It's irresponsible to paint me with that brush." Have you experienced threats like this before, or a security situation like this before in your public life, given that you've had a career as long as you have?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In all of the situations that we were in, it was trying to get attention to sit down and be able to talk. There was no threats. I went down to the AIDS activist hub in Greenwich Village, in the Gay and Lesbian Community Center, to talk about, and with the same people that were putting my head on a stake just to get my attention. And they got my attention, and I went and spoke to them. I felt completely safe in that environment because there were fundamental people who were struggling to get the attention of the government. What you saw at the hearing today was pure ad hominem. And I called him out because that's exactly what he's doing. He is raising money. Vote here, paid for by Rand Paul. Fire Fauci. He's killing you. He's murdering people. He's doing this. And by the way, donate here. Click this box. I mean, if that isn't absolutely proof of what's going on here, I mean, you can't miss that one, Chris.
I want to play another moment today that happened with Senator Marshall, who seemed very focused on your public financial disclosures, which are required by law and filed. And there was an exchange over them where he seemed to think that they weren't accessible, and they are. You can get them here. Here was that exchange. Take a listen.
Yes or no, would you be willing to submit to Congress and the public a financial disclosure that includes your past and current investments? After all, your colleague, Dr. Walensky, and every member of Congress submits a financial disclosure that includes their investments.
I don't understand why you're asking me that question. My financial disclosure is public knowledge and has been so for the last 37 years or so, 35 years. It is totally accessible to you if you want it.
For the public, is it accessible to the public?
To the public.
Great, we look forward
You
to
are
reviewing
totally incorrect.
Well, we look forward to reviewing it.
Senator Marshall, Dr. Fauci has answered you. It is public information, and he's happy to give it to you if you would ask. Senator Moran.
What a moron. Jesus Christ.
Did sound like you at the end there, Dr. Fauci. You seemed a little frustrated with that line of inquiry.
Well, you know, Chris, it just as an example, again, he was implying, if you listen to the entire dialogue, that in my position, responsible for drug trials and having so-called inside knowledge of what drug works and drug doesn't work, that maybe I was making investments sort of like ahead of the game here. He was totally implying that. And he made the statement that we can't get your financial statement. It was stunning to me that a United States senator doesn't realize that my financial statement is public knowledge. It was just like, where have you been?
I want to ask a final question here about where we find ourselves. I read your testimony. You talked about the Omicron wave today. There's one big worry I have, which is we looked at South Africa and we saw the curve. We saw a pretty big divergence between cases and hospitalizations. We saw that in Denmark, which was sort of at the front line of Omicron. We saw it in the UK. Even in a very vaccinated place like New York City, we have seen hospitalizations go up. The country's in a record hospitalization. We're not seeing that gap between hospitalization and cases here in the same way we saw in other places. And I wonder how much that worries you and what your theory for why that is.
Well, it's complicated, Chris. If you look at our cases, there really is, if you look at the difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, the charts are really, really rather profound, particularly among vaccinated and boosted individuals, where you see the overwhelming majority of the people who are in the hospital and are dying are people who are unvaccinated. It is true that this virus has a phenomenal degree of transmissibility. And the transmissibility means a lot of people are going to get infected. And I believe you are going to see, and we're already starting to see that when you talk anecdotally to the hospitals, they're seeing a lot of people who are getting infected, but it appears that the seriousness of it is less. And I think once we get through, since it's a big country and there's different regions with different levels of vaccination, different levels of what we call percentage of already infected individuals, that I believe you're going to see exactly what we've seen in South Africa, that you're going to see a big, big gap where this virus, even though it's highly infective, for the most part, is not going to be as severe. But when quantitatively you get so many people infected, even if the relative proportion of people who are hospitalized is less than with Delta, when you have such a volume of people infected, you're going to get a lot of serious disease, which is the reason why we now have something like 145,000 hospitalizations, 1,600 deaths, and over three-quarters of a million cases in one day. So we can't take this lightly.
All right, Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you so much for making time tonight.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
All right, we got a big show for you tonight. As the fight over the voting rights bill comes to a head, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker is here on President Biden's ultimatum: call the vote or change the filibuster. How soon until we see action? Plus, he brought you The Big Short, Vice, Anchorman, and more tonight. Filmmaker Adam McKay on his new breakthrough hit movie, Don't Look Up. He joins me live just ahead. Stick around. You don't want to miss it.
Roseanne Boyland was 34 when she died at the Capitol on January 6. 3 days later, I learned she was from my hometown. From MSNBC, I'm Ayman Mohyeldin, and this is American Radical, the story of how one woman became a foot soldier in one of the most dangerous movements in America.
It happened so quickly, just going from being a totally apolitical person to dying for Trump on January 6th.
American Radical, the newest MSNBC original podcast series. Search for American Radical wherever you're listening and follow.
Earlier today, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, the day after Georgia had its big win in the college football championship, as part of their big voting rights push. They attended a wreath laying at the crypt of Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, along with two of the King's children and their families. They visited the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King was pastor. And of course, that's the same church where Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock, whose election a year ago arguably helped spur the state's new voting restrictions, has been senior pastor for almost 17 years. The trip then culminated with a speech where Biden made his most vocal call yet for filibuster reform, a move that would allow two voting rights bills to pass the Senate by simple majority, throwing some very thinly veiled criticism at the Democratic senators who are now standing in the way.
I support changing the Senate rules, whichever way they need to be changed to prevent a minority of senators from blocking action on voting rights. When it comes to protecting majority rule in America, the majority should rule in the United States Senate. I ask every elected official in America, how do you want to be remembered? At consequential moments in history, they present a choice. Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? This is the moment to decide, to defend our elections, to defend our democracy.
After supporting the filibuster for many years, Democratic Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey came out against it last March, saying, quote, for the sake of our vulnerable populations, for the sake of America doing big things again, the filibuster has to be reformed. He is a co-sponsor of the For the People Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the two pieces of legislation that Biden advocated for today, and Senator Cory Booker joins me now. Senator, your reaction to today and the speech today, and what kind of effect you think the president stepping into this has?
Well, first and foremost, I think the president recognizes we're at a fundamentally inflection point in our democracy. You have this wave of voter suppression laws that are being passed now, really sourced by the big lie that somehow the election that Trump's own highest administrative sort of officials were saying was free and fair. Somehow we need to get these voting laws to fix something that's not broken. And really what they're doing is suppressing the votes of young people, Native Americans, minorities, disabled folks, and more. And so I think Joe Biden had to go out. I think he gave a tremendous full-throated endorsement. And does it have an effect? Look, you know this as well as I do. This is a personality issue. This is about a lot of individual senators and the decisions that they're going to have to make. And I think in many ways, Joe Biden's a respected guy here in the Senate. This is where he came up from. So I'm hoping it makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not. Look, everyone is trying the best they can on this, and also Build Back Better, right? Got a very thin majority. You need all 50 votes. To do anything, whether it's to change the rules to get the voting rights legislation or to pass Build Back Better, the math is the math. I'm not missing something, right? Like Sinema and Manchin say they won't vote to change the filibuster rules, and that is currently the position unless something changes.
Well, an important distinction. Build Back Better, there's arguments over the base bill. We are talking about two voting bills that have 50 Democratic senators on board with them. And senators saying, yeah, there are really problematic things with some of the laws that are being passed out there that will make it more difficult for some populations to vote. So we are all in agreement with that. The question now is, what do we do with the filibuster? And I think that's what really the grind of the conversations we've been having over these last weeks, many of which I've been in, about can we figure out, is it going to be a carve out? Is there a way to modify the rule? But the idea for most of us is this is the sacrosanct, most important right of a democracy, the voting of the people, and we need to make sure that we find a way to get this done.
Wait, when you came out, I mean, there has been progress on this, or at least migration among Democratic senators. I mean, back when I was 12 years ago during the Obama administration, when I was covering U.S. senators, they tended to not want to change the filibuster. Part of the reason is it does give each individual senator more power. I mean, just in a sort of mathematical sense, like there's fewer of you that need to get together to block stuff. What was your migration? And it does seem like if you take a step back, there's been a lot of movement into the column of we need to do something here.
Yeah, look, I'm going to be honest. I was one of these people that was really afraid. I saw Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Donald Trump trifecta. If there was no filibuster, I can only imagine what they would have done. And I was very worried about the most vulnerable populations in America, really so many Americans, what they would have done on the fundamental right of a woman to control her body, for example. So I had a lot of those fears and a lot of those concerns. Now, I migrated quickly. One, the history of the filibuster. It's not part of our history. It's not in the Constitution. This is something that really flared up and used to stop civil rights legislation, really to stop the rights of minorities. And the fact that the law has been changed, the filibuster rule, has been changed in the 70s, in the 80s. It was changed in 2013. Mitch McConnell changed it to get Supreme Court justices there. And the other final thing that really pushed me was the fact of how many of the things we are not getting done in this body that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe in. Take common sense background checks. Think Roe v. Wade. That somehow we are now in a nation where the things that we agree on aren't getting done. And voters, knowing that if we get that alignment again of McConnell, Ryan, and Trump, they will be more aware that there's even more consequences if we don't engage. And so I've moved a long way, and I'm hoping, and I've loved to see the wisdom of some of my colleagues who've moved as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was what was striking to me about watching Joe Biden give this speech today, right? This is a person who is very much a creature of the United States Senate. Yeah. One of the longest serving senators we've had recently. And I think, if you asked him very recently, I mean, he is someone who is very molded and adapted to those norms. It is striking to see him making this call from the lectern as the president towards his former body. Yeah, well, look, the filibuster in a long period, early 1900s to the 1970s, was used on average one time a year. It was a rarely invoked thing. Right. It wasn't invoked in Supreme Court justices. It wasn't invoked for a lot of major pieces of legislation. It began to be abused, especially with Mitch McConnell. Really taking the filibuster to a whole new level under Barack Obama. So to say that Joe Biden has changed, the real change you need to point to is the way the modern Republican Party picked up the filibuster and so abused it to the point now where many of us are saying this is ridiculous. We're stopping some fundamental progress in our country that the majority of people agree with. We need to revisit this filibuster. All right, Senator Cory Booker, it's been good to have you on tonight. Thanks a lot. It's great to be on. Thanks, man. And Happy New Year to you. All right. You too, man. Don't go anywhere. My interview with award-winning filmmaker Adam McKay about his new Netflix phenomenon. Don't Look Up is just ahead. You do not want to miss it. Tonight, the committee investigating the January 6th insurrection made a number of big moves. We learned that they issued 3 new subpoenas asking for testimony and documents from 2 advisors to Donald Trump Jr., as well as a staffer who helped draft the speech that Donald Trump delivered on January 6th at the Ellipse. That's the one where he said, we're all going to go march down to the Capitol. Now, today, the committee chair, Congressman Benny Thompson, Mississippi, said they also want to hear from Rudy Giuliani, not ruling out a subpoena to compel testimony about the events surrounding the Capitol riot. Thompson also said the committee is examining their authority to issue subpoenas for fellow members of Congress and if those subpoenas would be enforceable after Republican Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio said he would not cooperate with the request to sit for an interview. As the committee contends with Republican resistance in Congress, they are also in contact with former Vice President Mike Pence. The New York Times reports that the committee has been in touch with Pence's lawyers since last summer and has been gauging his willingness to speak with investigators, reporting that in recent weeks, Pence has grown increasingly disillusioned with the idea of voluntarily cooperating, seeing the committee's consideration of criminal referrals for Donald Trump and others as designed to hurt Republican chances of winning control of Congress in November. But even with all that obstruction, the committee seems to be moving forward towards laying out the facts and building a case against the ex-president. In plea negotiations, federal prosecutors, these are, of course, people working for the Department of Justice, recently began asking defense lawyers for some of those charged in the insurrection who were pleading out if their clients would admit in sworn statements that they stormed the Capitol believing that Trump wanted them to stop Pence from certifying the election. Chairman Thompson told reporters the committee will meet tomorrow. As the committee continues to move forward with the investigation portion of their inquiry, we also know they are preparing for the possibility of televised primetime hearings. So there's a lot going on. And right now, they are, of course, working against the clock with the midterm elections and the very strong possibility of a Republican takeover in Congress looming large in less than 10 months.
This is not real. This is not real. This is not real. This isn't happening. Kate, tell me this isn't really happening.
I hear there's something you don't like the looks of.
We discovered a very large comet.
Oh, good for you. It's headed directly towards Earth.
This comet is what we call a planet killer.
At this exact moment, I say we sit tight and assess.
Sit tight and assess?
Sit tight.
And then assess. The sit tight part comes first, then you got to digest it. That's the assessment period.
That is part of the trailer from one of the most successful films in Netflix history. Since it debuted on that streaming platform on Christmas Eve, Don't Look Up has been viewed tens of millions of times, and unlike most movies these days, it has become part of the cultural conversation. Now, the movie is a satire. It's a bang-you-on-the-head allegory for climate change. Here's the premise. There's a giant comet that is on course to destroy Earth, and in a few short weeks, it will impact the planet, ending all life as we know it. When two astronomers, played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, try to sound the alarm about the impending imminent Armageddon, they are met with a resounding shrug. Take this scene where they attempt to warn the president, played by Meryl Streep, about their discovery.
There will be mile-high tsunamis fanning out all across the globe. If this comet makes impact, it will have the power of a billion Hiroshima bombs. There will be magnitude 10 or 11 earthquakes.
You're breathing weird. It's making me uncomfortable.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to articulate the science.
I know, but it's like so stressful. I like trying to listen.
I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation.
So the politicians are too worried about sounding like alarmists to do anything. And what's worse, they're lobbied by big business to not stop the comet because there's a tech billionaire and big donor who is more interested in the economic opportunities it might present. He can mine the minerals on it. As one character puts it quite hilariously, we're for the jobs the comet is going to provide. Sound familiar? But it's not just politicians that are incapable of dealing with the imminent catastrophe. When our heroes take their pitch to the media, this is how that goes.
I'm sorry, are we not being clear? We're trying to tell you that the entire planet is about to be destroyed.
Okay. Well, it's, just something we do around here. We just keep the bad news light.
Right. It helps the medicine go down. And speaking of medicine, tomorrow we've got a
maybe the destruction of the entire planet isn't supposed to be fun. Maybe it's supposed to be terrifying and unsettling.
Oh, please don't do that.
And you should stay up all night, every night, crying when we're all 100% for sure gonna die.
Overall, the movie paints a damning portrait of humanity's inaction when it comes to giant world-ending catastrophes. And I gotta say, the movie is really like punching through the cultural zeitgeist just in time for the annual reminder of the actual world's biggest threat right now, the non-allegorical catastrophe we're facing. Last year was the 5th hottest on record. The last 7 years have been the hottest 7 years on record. For the 6th year in a row, ocean temperatures were the hottest on record. According to one climate scientist, the oceans have absorbed the heat equivalent to 7 Hiroshima atomic bombs detonating each second, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's the climate reality that Don't Look Up forces us to look at. And the man behind that remarkable film, Adam McKay, joins me here live next.
This comet is what we call a planet killer.
That is correct.
So how certain is this?
There's 100% certainty of impact.
Please, don't say 100%.
Can we just call it a potentially significant event?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it isn't potentially going to happen. It is going to happen.
Exactly, 99.78% to be exact.
Oh, great. Okay, so it's not 100%.
The climate satire Don't Look Up debuted on Netflix 2.5 weeks ago. It has already become the second most watched film in that streaming channel's history. Lots of people love it, some people hate it, but everyone seems to be talking about it. And joining me now is the filmmaker behind it, director Adam McKay. Adam, it is very hard to get movies, I think, to break through into cultural conversations these days, just for a million different reasons, some of which I think you satirize in the film. Are you surprised, gratified, glad to see how much conversation this movie has kicked off?
I mean, our whole team, we were blown away by the world reaction to this. The movie was always predicated on the idea that we're living in very anxious, uncertain times, and to see hundreds of millions of people respond to that, I've never experienced anything like it in my entire experience. And I've made a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows. So, yeah, it's been pretty incredible.
Talk to me about the allegory. I know our mutual friend David Sirota and you were talking about this, and he said it's like a comet is going to hit Earth. But why the allegory? How did you think through trying to tell a compelling story and in a sort of fictional world about climate?
Yeah, so the whole idea was I tried to write about 4 or 5 different movies, and each one had their limitations. There were some that were dramatic, dystopic. There were others that were clever with kind of a Twilight Zone twist. And it just came from an offhanded conversation that I had with David Sirota, where he said, like, oh, it's like Armageddon and the asteroid's going to hit and no one cares. And I just went, that's the movie. And what I liked about it was it's a big idea. It's not a super small, niche-y, clever idea, but it's something we can all relate to. And I love that it was funny. I really thought, like, from my experience in doing comedy for years, what I've noticed is when 300, 400, 500 people are together and they're laughing, there's a high bar of truth. It's very hard to get people to laugh when something is false. I mean, if you want to do a joke where the joke is billionaires are taxed too much, well, good luck with that, because they're really not. And I thought that ultimately the reality of the comet's going to hit Earth, clearly as a metaphor for climate change, and a bunch of other realities like income inequality, corruption in our government, that a lot of people could really identify with that. But I never dreamed that the response would be this overwhelming. It's been incredible.
So there's two parts about this that I think are interesting to zoom in on. I mean, one is that the dread that you're talking about. I mean, trying to find a way through the dread, around the dread, which is in some ways the story of the movie, right? Like when she says like we're all going to die and living with that part of the problem and part of the difficulty of truly internalizing what is bearing down us on the climate is precisely like a natural human allergy to contemplating that, which I think you do a really good job of capturing in the film across all players involved in it when they say like, it's not just the media types, the political types, like everyone rebels a little bit at contemplating the end of the earth.
Yeah, the story is so big, what we're confronting right now with the end of the livable climate. And we're in the middle of it right now, make no mistake about it, that it challenges the imagination. And in fairness to everyone who's resistant to it, or thinks that we're overblowing it, or thinks that it's just like Y2K, this is real and it's happening now. And until 4 years ago, I was in the group of people that were like, oh yeah, that's an issue. And it was only because I ran headlong into David Wallace Wells's book, Uninhabitable Earth, which I highly recommend anyone out there read, or the IPCC reports from the UN, that I finally got that chill in my bones and I understood what the climate scientists were feeling and why they're so emotional and why they're so frustrated. We really are looking at the biggest story and threat to life in human history. And yet, I'm not going to lie, I'm way too invested in Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck hitting it off and then finally finding happiness.
Well, I'm also rooting for them. I think I find it truly and genuinely delightful as a story, I have to say. But that relates, right? Because so one of the things I think it's really sophisticated and funny and powerful about the film is that the first part of it is getting attention. And you and I offline have discussed the difficulties of covering climate, how undercover climate is, right? And I agree on that. But in the first part of the movie, it's like, well, if we can get attention, then we can do it. Like people just have to know, obviously, that the comet's coming and then we'll do something. That's sort of one of the first hero's quest. And then they get the attention and then that doesn't solve it, which leads to sort of a second hero's quest. But that second part is also really profound, where it's like the warning goes out, the comet's up there, and then the way the culture and politics process and information makes it very hard to act on.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a very strange place right now where we have all this new tech blossoming, but it's also all profitized. They make money off of engagement, misunderstanding. Our media makes a lot of money off of us not comprehending and dealing with simple truths. And by the way, I say this not from some holier than thou spot. You're obviously someone I know and respect, and there's a lot of great journalists who are covering climate change who are doing really good work. But the truth is the system is so bizarrely cranked up right now that I just don't know if we have that room to really take in a truth as complex as the collapse of the livable climate, which is happening. Make no mistake about it. You saw in Kentucky, Colorado, the crazy record high temperatures up in Alaska that were just off the charts. And I just read a story the other day where they said that according to new models, computer models, that in 8 years, 50% of our days will be 1 out of 100-year heat events. And I read this article and I'm like, well, where is that? Like, why am I not hearing that in my media? But I understand it. I mean, stuff is so crazy right now. We're in such a chaos of change that to drop that on people and then go to a commercial for Subway or, the new Ford Tundra, how does that even make any sense?
Well, and I think, I think the other part of it too is like, okay, well, what do you do with it? For the people that do, like the comet is coming and we have to get together to stop it. And you said this thing, I think the other day on Twitter, which I agree with, is like, there really isn't the sense of all hands on deck about this in the way there has to be. And that means like across the spectrum, like we have to be shutting down coal. We have to be like creating crazy moonshots to try to do carbon capture tech. Like a lot of things we need to try all at once. And the full spectrum, it feels like we're just nowhere near close to that.
Yeah, the emotional bandwidth we need to be living in right now, and this is me as a non-scientist who's heard about this, so I'm sure I only get about 10% of it, is somewhere in between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the initial bombing of London. And we're at don't use aerosol cans because of the hole in the ozone or Y2K. I mean, we're nowhere near the reality of it. So clearly we're all failing. And by the way, once again, if you notice in the movie, we take shots at Hollywood, which includes me. We take shots at everyone across the board. We're failing in a tremendous way to convey these truths. And it may simply be a matter of our format is wrong. We may need to do 3 times longer segments before a commercial break. Our movies may need to be 4 times longer. I don't know. But yeah, the gulf between the reality and how we're perceiving is massive and very disturbing.
Adam McKay, it's a great movie. You should check it out if you haven't. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Always a pleasure.
That does it for All In. You can catch us every weeknight at 8 o'clock on MSNBC. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/allinwithchris.